The first gameplay footage of Fable has now been revealed, and for many viewers it may have felt familiar. Certain elements, such as a chicken-like monster, stylized sword combat, and cinematic finishing move, evoke clear comparisons to The Witcher 3. This resemblance is not entirely coincidental. Several former developers from CD Projekt Red, including a combat designer who worked on The Witcher, are involved in the new project. The question, however, is whether these similarities are merely surface level, or whether the reboot aims to become an epic fantasy role-playing game, comparable in scope and tone to The Witcher 3. Fable is set in the fantasy kingdom of Albion. While the setting remains unchanged, early concept art for the reboot appears darker and more reminiscent of titles such as Thief or The Witcher trilogy than of earlier Fable games. This aesthetic shift may lead newcomers to interpret the game as traditional dark fantasy. However, developer Playground Games emphasizes that Fable is fundamentally a fairy tale rather than classic high fantasy. The distinction, according to the studio, is deliberate. Epic fantasy typically revolves around large-scale geopolitical conflicts and world-altering events, as seen in works like Game of Thrones, The Lord of the Rings, or The Witcher. Fairy tales, by contrast, focus on ordinary individuals whose lives intersect with magic. These stories are more intimate in scope and often explore moral lessons. In this sense, Fable aligns more closely with traditional fairy tales such as Little Red Riding Hood than with sweeping epics like The Lord of the Rings. Although The Witcher 3 also draws heavily from European folklore and fairy tales, Fable distinguishes itself through its tone. A defining characteristic of the series has always been its distinctly British humor. Characters often behave less like participants in a grim fantasy drama and more like figures in a British comedy, maintaining composure and understatement even in the face of supernatural events. One major structural change concerns the morality system. Previous entries in the series relied on a clear good versus evil alignment model. The reboot abandons this binary framework. Instead, player actions have consequences that affect the game world and its inhabitants, shaping the protagonist's reputation among different groups. Choice and consequence have always been central to Fable. Even the original 2004 game allowed players to unlock titles based on their deeds. The new system expands on this idea. Rather than applying a universal moral judgment, individual characters respond differently depending on their own values, social background, and circumstances. Reputation is influenced not only by major quest decisions but also by more subtle factors, such as the player's wealth. A prosperous character might be perceived as a visionary investor restoring Albion to prosperity, or as a greedy opportunist. These judgments vary depending on perspective. The trailer does not clarify how deeply these systems are integrated into gameplay. It remains uncertain whether reputation changes will have far-reaching mechanical consequences or remain largely cosmetic. In the new Fable, NPC behavior is intended to be more dynamic than in many comparable role-playing games. Similar to systems seen in Gothic or Oblivion, each character reportedly follows a daily routine that can vary throughout the week. Characters evaluate the player according to specific criteria, and certain decisions may permanently alter their lives. An example provided in the gameplay footage involves the giant Dave. If the player chooses to kill him, his body crashes into a residential district and remains there for the rest of the game. This action affects local residents' opinions of the player and has tangible economic consequences, such as lowering property values in the area. As a result, the player's reputation can differ significantly between regions. The world appears to be divided into multiple settlements, including the major cities of Bowerstone and Bloodstone, the latter known from Fable 2. Unlike hub-based structures separated by loading screens, such as Skellige and Velen in The Witcher 3, the reboot promises seamless exploration. All areas are intended to be accessible from the outset without interruption. Whether this open structure will meaningfully influence quest progression remains speculative. It is conceivable that the order in which players explore regions, purchase property, and complete quests could affect subsequent events. Nevertheless, a central main storyline will likely guide players along a suggested path, potentially with more branching options than typical open-world games. Combat represents one of the clearest parallels to The Witcher 3. Players can switch between various weapons and chain attacks together. Available options include swords, axes, hammers, bows, crossbows, and magic, and characters can be developed across these disciplines according to player preference. Mechanically, the footage shows familiar elements: dodge rolls, blocking, magical abilities that destabilize enemies, and powerful finishing moves against staggered opponents. While The Witcher 3's combat was sometimes criticized for lacking depth or precision, it was widely considered functional and stylish. The new Fable appears to draw inspiration from that model without necessarily inheriting its shortcomings. The fluid chaining of attacks resembles systems seen in action-oriented games such as the Batman Arkham series. Playground Games has demonstrated expertise in responsive arcade-style mechanics through the Forza Horizon franchise. Whether this experience translates effectively into action role-playing combat remains to be seen, but there is cautious optimism. Unlike Geralt in The Witcher, players in Fable create their own protagonist. The character can be male or female and customized with different facial options. In earlier games, moral alignment visibly altered the character's appearance, shifting them toward angelic or demonic traits. This feature has reportedly been removed in the reboot, though other forms of lasting visual change may still occur. Life simulation elements remained part of the series' identity. In the original game, players guided their hero from childhood to old age. Marriage and in later entries, having children were possible. However, romantic relationships function primarily as gameplay mechanics rather than deeply integrated narrative arcs. Players expecting story-driven relationships comparable to Geralt and Yennefer may find this aspect less developed. The tone also suggests less explicit romantic content. Overall, the reboot appears influenced by 2 decades of role-playing development, with particular parallels to The Witcher 3. Beyond combat, similarities include the move away from binary morality toward a more nuanced system of competing interests and consequences. Certain visual elements, such as swamp spirits resembling wraiths and the aforementioned chicken-like creature, also invite comparison. Given that both games draw inspiration from European folklore, thematic overlap is unsurprising. The tonal distinction remains significant, however. Slavic melancholy and bleakness on one side, absurd British humor on the other. Based on currently available material, Fable seems positioned as a modern action RPG that aims to compete with leading titles in the genre. The visual style appears less exaggerated than in earlier entries, characters are somewhat less cartoonish, and moral themes appear more ambiguous. Rather than presenting a purely nostalgic revival, Playground Games appears intent on delivering a contemporary RPG that incorporates established genre conventions while retaining the series' distinctive identity.